Welcome to Confessions of a Parent Coach. I'm Coach, a mother of four, and potty talker, Ann Kaplan. This is the podcast where I confess something from my own parenting and coaching life, teach a lesson around it, and answer your questions. Even we parenting experts are far from perfect, and the real magic happens when we get down with all that imperfection. We get into the gritty side of parenting here, so earbud up and dive in.
Welcome into another episode of the podcast, everybody. I'm excited to be here with you again this week. Frankly, I'm excited that I'm able to record an episode right now because I'm on day 5, I think, after having dental surgery, and I can just tell you that it is terrible. I have stitches in my mouth still, but at least I don't look like a chipmunk on half of my face anymore. But definitely still, riding the ibuprofen and wow. So the fact that I'm just able to speak continuously for a long enough episode to record an episode of the podcast is an accomplishment for me. And maybe the next thing I'll be able to do is eat solid food. But really looking forward to talking about this topic with you. This is something to me that is sort of a topic that bridges and touches on many different arenas. So I'm going to kind of first sort of show it to you in terms of like all of this, different information that we have about how a parent's presence really makes a difference in a kid's experience of life and things like that. And then I'm going to actually kind of connect the dots to a concept that we talk about a lot in internal family systems. So you'll see what I mean as the episode unfolds. But really, it's all about sort of the connection between like co-regulation and doing our own personal growth work and internal family systems and all of that stuff. And the concept that we're ultimately going to get to when when it comes to IFS is an expression that really rings true. And I think it's going to probably stick in your mind too after we unpack it today, which is self begets self and parts beget parts. And that may or may not make any sense to you right now, and that's okay. That's what we're going to be building towards today in our episode. And as always, starting off with a confession. So, my confession for you this week is really about my own personal work and how, I have sort of like dabbled in meditation to varying degrees over my sort of course of my own sort of personal growth journey and just sort of confessing for you because I know I happens to me all the time that I have clients who think that I must be just like when I'm not working with them just like sort of sitting on a meditation pillow, being super zen and like, hovering a few inches off the surface of the earth or something like that. And everything is amazing in my parenting and my relationships with my kids and all that stuff. And that is definitely not the case. And this is a really great example. I fall off the wagon of meditation all the time. And, there were times in my life where I was meditating like more than an hour a day. And, there are times when I'm like very consistent with meditation, even if it's only for like 10 minutes a day and all that stuff. And then there are big chunks of time where I just fall off and don't do it at all. And I just kind of like, sort of get sucked into the busyness of my day and all of that stuff. And, the reason why I chose this specific confession for you today is because it really does illustrate in a very concrete way what this expression self begets self and parts beget parts means. Because when I'm consistently meditating, even if my meditations every day are not great, which by the way, most of the time they're not. That's another confession for you. Like a lot of times in my meditation, I might only find like one 3-second moment in my entire meditation where I truly am like present and, connected to what I'm doing and not, experiencing all these like thoughts cropping up into my head and things like that. And there are other times where I do meditation and I don't have any of those moments, not even 1 second. And I spend the entire meditation just perseverating on something that I'm going to deal with when the meditation's over, or something that happened yesterday that's still kind of stuck in my craw. Like, even when I have just all crappy meditations in a week, I meditate every day of the week, but all of them are just these really, you know, not blissful or not um obviously productive meditation sessions. Even then, my experience of the rest of my day, so the other 23 hours and 90 minute or 50 minutes of my day, is impacted by the fact that I did those 10 minutes of crappy meditation. Um, it really does have a cumulative effect, and it really does change just, I don't know, sort of like my energetic state the rest of the day, the way I engage with the world, how much sort of like presence or awareness I have in moments to respond, like in the heat of the moment, to something, how I interact with my family. Those things are definitely impacted by regular meditation, no matter what quality the meditation is. And I've known that, I've lived that, I've experienced that multiple times over the last, let's say, 10 years. It is a true thing. It's indisputable. It's not something that I don't believe or something like that. And yet, I will still fall off with my routine for months at a time. And to me, that phenomenon is a really great illustration of self begets self and parts beget parts. So, what do I mean when I say that? Okay, well, if you've listened to any of my previous podcast episodes, or if you're working with me right now, you might have already experienced this, or maybe you've been reading my emails. Um, One of the modalities that I use with my clients is internal family systems. And one of the sort of vocabulary words, I guess we'll say, that we use in IFS is self energy. So everybody has a self, and your self is characterized by these beautiful traits of calmness, compassion, creativity, clarity, connectedness. They all start with C's. It's really nice, but there's lots of other words that don't start with C, like maybe openness, empathy. Sometimes with my clients, especially if we're working with like a really um, charged or like hot button issue, sometimes the first experience of self energy that my clients have toward a specific, aspect of themselves is neutrality, or I would say even like acceptance, instead of like, oh, I hate this part of myself. It's, I don't know how I feel toward it, or I don't feel anything, or, oh, there you are, is one way that one of my clients put it one time. So that's kind of that self that we all have. We all have self energy. That's the energy that comes from our true adult, like wise higher self. And then we all have these like parts of ourselves, these aspects to our sort of personality construct, these aspects to our ego that are not characterized by self energy. And they, sometimes when they're not getting the attention and healing that they need from us, kind of can be self-destructive a little bit. That part of yourself that flies off the handle at Thanksgiving dinner when someone brings up politics, or that part of you that can't avoid Halloween candy when it's put in front of you, or that part of you that kind of isolates and hides from the world when things aren't going well, or the part of you that doesn't like asking for help, or the part of you that pretends you have all the answers when you don't, right? We all have all these parts of ourselves. And we would say that when you're really blended with those parts, they're kind of running the show. They're not in charge, or they are in charge. Yourself is not in charge, and so you are really in a parts situation. And when you're have more access to that self energy, those parts don't go away, but the whole system, all of those parts and all of the other aspects of you are being led by self, or you're being self led. So when we say parts beget parts or self beget self, what we're saying is the more self energy you have, the more self energy you can continue to grow inside of you. Also, when you're interacting with people, the more self energy you bring to that interaction, the more likely you are to receive self energy from the person you're interacting with instead of their parts. And if you are on my email list, the email this that went out that's going out about this podcast episode has an image that I drew a long time ago at a retreat that I ran maybe like 3 years ago, the fall retreat. um and it really shows like how we all have this sort of core self, and then we have this like system of parts and triggers and reactions and extreme behaviors and beliefs and things like that, that is kind of like this big sort of like it kind of reminds me of the drawing kind of reminds me of Ghostbusters, that Slimer looks like Slimer. I didn't mean to draw Slimer, but I think I drew Slimer a little bit. That's kind of like coming out of us, and that we could either have our Slimers interacting with each other, those parts interacting with each other, or we can be interacting with each other from self energy. And the more that we show up in those situations in self energy, the more likely we are to get that true higher self in return from the person we're interacting with. And the more that we show up as our Slimer, the more we show up blended with our parts, the more likely we are to be interacting with somebody else's parts instead of their true self. So that's what that idea of self beget self, parts beget parts really means. And you can see how this is totally true in my story about my meditation, right? Like when I'm meditating regularly, that means that I'm spending, even if it's just a second every day, in like really connected to self energy with nothing else. No, all of my parts have calmed down long enough to just let me be. And that kind of gets back to that whole being versus doing stuff that we were talking about a few weeks ago. My parts kind of just calm down. That sort of turbulent system just finds some tranquility and calmness just for a minute. And I'm connected to self energy. It means that for the rest of the day I have more self energy. I have more access to self energy, and I bring that forward more um in the rest of my day. And when I do that and I show up with self energy when I'm interacting with my husband or talking to my kids, I'm much more likely to be engaging with their true selves instead of, all of their parts and things like that. So, and that's exactly what happens when I fall off the wagon of meditation, right? When I'm not meditating, I'm bringing less self energy. My life feels more tumultuous. I am more blended with my parts. I am actually be getting more and more parts situations or parts experiences in my day and less self experiences in my day. And the same thing is true with my interactions. What do I get in return from other people? You know, probably not a whole lot of true self stuff happening there. So, I actually want to tell you two stories that have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with internal family systems that can kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. So, if you listened a long, long time ago, I did an episode on co-regulation. And one of the things I talked about in there is literally what we know about babies' nervous systems and how they kind of interact with with our nervous systems, and that when newborn babies are first born, their autonomic nervous system, so that independent part of us that's running all the time in the background that we don't have any control over, like our heart beating or our temperature regulation or breathing or those kinds of things. Babies' autonomic nervous systems are not fully developed when they're born. And so, them being in the presence of their caregiver is what helps them pace that nervous system to something that's functioning. This is why when we co-sleep, it reduces the incidence of SIDS, for example. When babies are with in the presence of a care provider, their nervous system literally changes. It syncs to that nervous system of the care provider. So, well, how does that work? Maybe more in as babies get older, or even when they're newborns, this is still happening. What does that mean when the care provider's nervous system is kind of out of whack the whole time that it's with the baby, right? Like, what does it mean when your baby's co-regulating to you and you are stressed out all the time? Your breathing is erratic, you're feeling a sense of anxiety and panic. Your nervous system is not in a state of rhythmic regularity and calm. It's at this elevated state. Well, guess what? That's what your baby co-regulates to. So how does this connect to that self beget self, parts beget parts? Well, it makes perfect sense. That parent who or caregiver who is taking care of themselves and allowing themselves to be in a state of relaxation and safety and feeling safe is going to be bringing that energy to that co-regulating dynamic that's happening between them and the child. And that helps the child formulate and develop a nervous system that has that same sort of sense of safety and security. So that's such a great, beautiful, literally a kind of like biological illustration of self begetting self or parts begetting parts. That parent, that care provider being in that sort of fight or flight state. That's, we would say, using IFS lingo, you're blended with your parts. You're in a parts place. You're not feeling self energy. You're feeling panic or worry or stress or tension or hurry, urgency, all of those things. Well, that's that caregiver being in that sort of like parts state. And guess what that's doing for the child's co-regulating to that. So you're getting that part, that parent or that caregiver's parts are begetting the child's parts. And when the parent has a high access or high degree of self energy happening inside of them, that parent's or that caregiver's self energy is begetting the child's self energy. This is a scientific thing that we know happens. And what most parents do with that information is beat themselves up. Like, oh my gosh, so that means I'm never allowed to be stressed, or I have to be calm, or the fact that I had postpartum depression probably screwed up my kid for life, or whatever. That's not what this means. What this really means is doing whatever you need to do to take care of yourself and find that access to self and be present in your true self with your child. It's worth it. If that means therapy, if that means daily meditation, if that means prayer, if that means working with me, if that means doing internal family systems work with another practitioner, or whatever that means, that is a really, really important thing that you can do to help your child. So I have a client who I was doing a session with recently who, we were kind of talking about the importance of doing all this work and stuff like that. And she was just like, well, but like, what do I do though when my kid is, stressed out? Like, how do I help him? And, we talked about, some specific concrete things that were very specific to her child and her, situation and her child's age and all that good stuff. But the foundational thing that we talked about was you being in a state of calmness and sort of nervous system safety you doing this work so that when your child is struggling, you still maintain access to self energy and you're not all of a sudden flooded with all of these parts coming in and hijacking your system, that is helping your child. We know that. We know that scientifically. It's not some sort of airy fairy new age hippie mumbo jumbo. It's a very real thing. So, and it's hard for us to believe that, right? Because why? Well, we have parts of ourselves that think there's got to be something else. Or the way that for me to like not mess my kid up with my nervous system is to just sort of like tell myself I'm not allowed to freak out or whatever. Well, that's just another part of you trying to kind of take over and say, don't freak out, don't freak out. That part of you that feels guilty when you aren't, zen with your kids or whatever. That's not self energy. That's another aspect of your personality construct that is trying to take over and steer the ship. So there's another example of this that a long, long time ago, you might not even know this about me, but my first iteration of this career that I have, I was a birth doula. And so I attended lots of births and got certified and trained as a birth doula. And one of the studies that they showed us, back many, many years ago, that was done, I think it might have been done in like the 70s or 80s or something like that, was a study where they kind of randomly grouped moms coming into the hospital to have their babies into three groups. One, there was no change. They just went and had their babies just the way that they would have if they weren't doing this study. Then there was a group that was assigned a doula who did all the doula stuff. And then there was a group that was assigned a doula, but the doula didn't do anything. The doula just sat in the corner of the room and was just present during the birth, didn't interact, and or do any of her like cool doula stuff. And the difference that they noticed in birth outcomes, well, of course, as you can imagine, the group that had the actively engaged doulas had the best birth outcomes. So like shorter length of labor, less interventions, less complications, etc. But what was also really amazing was the group that just had the doula sitting in the room also had a very measurable difference in their birth outcomes from the control group. And they tell you this story when you're first becoming a doula to illustrate the point that like just having a calm presence in the room while a woman is having a baby is impactful. Just being there and that person not feeling alone and that person knowing that there's somebody else there who's calm and not panicking, that laboring person is co-regulating to that state, and they're also just aware that they're not alone, that they're not sort of unsafe or abandoned, or they don't have a reason to be scared or less reasons to be scared and things like that. And we know that those kind of states of being, that emotional state, also has measurable impacts on birth outcomes. So it makes perfect sense that just having that person in the room would make a difference to birth outcomes. So these are just examples that always pop into my mind when I talk to my clients about the idea of self energy begetting more self energy and parts begetting more parts. And I can tell you from my personal experience, I've had 4 children, and my first birth was really, it was a hot mess. And one of the biggest memories I have of my birth experience was someone in the room who looked very uncomfortable and scared and worried. And multiple times during my labor, I turned to her and said, like, is something wrong? Because you seem like you think something's wrong. And then she would say, oh, no, nothing's wrong. But then just sit in the corner, biting her nails and panicking. And I promise you that had a big impact on me. Otherwise, I wouldn't remember it 21 years later. So this energy, that's an example of somebody's parts. I actually did find out when I went back for my 6-week checkup after my son was born that person had left the obstetric practice that I had that I was working with because they always felt anxiety at births and they finally realized that they didn't want to do this anymore. So it wasn't just in my head that this person was anxious and had all these parts coming up for her that were present at my birth. So that's a great example of somebody else's parts begetting my parts, and it definitely had an impact on my birth experience. So um this self begetting self, parts begetting parts, it's a very, very true and real thing. And you know what, you've probably experienced this all the time. um if you're quiet and calm during a conversation with someone, it's much more likely to go well, right? If you're around someone who's like frantic and stressed all the time, you probably feel either that you want to get as far away from them as possible, or you feel like, okay, let me join you in your panic and stress, let's both freak out, right? Or you might even have a part that's taking over that's saying, this person's freaking out. So you need to be calm and you need to take charge, right? Those people that we always say that they're calm under pressure. That's really cool. That's also probably a part of their system that is very useful in that moment and wonderful. But we wouldn't say that that's necessarily self energy. So, when you think about parts begetting parts and self begetting self, I want you to think about a couple things. Like, first of all, like what would be different throughout your day if you were experiencing a high degree of self energy? Like, how would your experience of your day be different? How would your interactions with your family be different? Maybe you can even think of like run yesterday through your head and think, what would have gone differently yesterday if I had more self energy than I did? If I had access to, and I was really acting from self, if I was self led all day yesterday, what would that have looked like? And especially when it comes to parenting, thinking about like, well, how my parenting be different? What would self led parenting look like? Which is something we talked about in a previous episode. How would my parenting yesterday have been different if I had been self led the whole day? And then I want to ask you another question, which is what's something that you could do that would increase the access you have to self energy throughout your day? Maybe it's meditation, like I was talking about. Maybe it is working with me and finally reaching out and setting up that discovery call that's been on your mind, but you haven't done it up until now. Um, maybe it's reaching out to a different practitioner. Maybe it's giving yourself just, I know I have some clients who really love that whole like miracle morning routine. Whatever it is for you, what's one thing that you can do that just ticks even one notch higher the access that you have to self energy throughout your day? I'm going to leave you with one other thing that I do and I never fall off the wagon with. That's a huge self energy booster for me, which is exercise. Unfortunately, this whole week since I've had surgery, I have not been able to exercise. You're not allowed to do anything that like elevates your heart rate for like a week after surgery. So actually, I'm going to go to the gym tomorrow and I cannot wait. I can tell you that makes a big difference in how I feel throughout the day. And when I am exercising, I am absolutely in a flow state. Like I'm not thinking about later, I'm not thinking about before, I'm not thinking about um anything other than just being with myself and being in the moment. And I absolutely feel that self energy coursing through myself. And you know what? There's some other C's about self energy that I don't feel all the time. But when I'm working out and that's my avenue to connecting with self, it absolutely comes through. And those are things like courage and confidence, sometimes things that maybe wouldn't be my number one or two descriptions of what self energy feels like, but when I'm exercising, absolutely. That's sometimes we think about self energy as just being like this relaxed zen meditative state, which it totally can be, but also is an extremely powerful state. It's an extremely strong state. It's an extremely impactful state. And when I'm exercising, I get to feel that too. So think about what could bring that forward for you. And if that one thing that you can do today is click on the link and book your consultation with me, that is a really big thing that would take you probably 3 minutes. Less time than it would take to meditate is how much time it would take you to book that consultation with me. And I guarantee that's a big thing you can do to increase your access to self energy, not just for one day, but probably for the rest of your life, because that's my jam. That's the whole thing that I do with my clients in a myriad of different ways. We don't always use internal family systems. We don't always use the Enneagram, which is the other thing you hear me talk about a lot on the podcast. But in all different ways, all the work that I do is about raising awareness, increasing your level of consciousness, and really helping you live your life and engage with the world from your true self. I hope that's helpful for you. I can't wait to talk to you again next week. Bye, everybody.
The episode is over, but there's more waiting for you. You can grab my free workbook, Getting Kids to Listen the First Time, that walks you through the fundamental principles I teach all of my clients and applies them to this very universal parenting challenge. So if you're sick of repeating yourself all day long or just want to learn more about my style, you'll definitely want to go to bit.ly/kidswholisten. And if you're ready to work with me, let's meet. Set up a free call at bit.ly/Kaplan call, and let's create an action plan that gets you exactly where you want to go. And of course, links to all this goodness are in the show notes. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time.